Hello, my name's AnneReathWarren, and I work as a researcher of multilingualism in education at the Department of Education at Uppsala University in Sweden. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about some preliminary results that I've reached from an analysis of reported linguistic practices from focus group interviews conducted with high school students who were studying mother tongues or community languages in different forms of education in Sweden and in Australia. I'll start out by talking a little bit about terminology used in this field, then give some contextual and background information on these forms of education that I've investigated, a quick look at the literature and the theory, onto the methods, results, and then the implications of the study. So I'll start out by talking a little bit about the word mother tongue. The name of the subject that I've investigated in Sweden is called mother tongue instruction. It was originally called home language instruction in 1977 when it was introduced into the Swedish school. But after 20 years of discussions and debates, this term was changed. The term home language was thought to index the use of those languages to the home environment only, rather than indicating that these languages were useful in other domains and contexts as well. So the subject name was changed to mother tongue instruction, which brings with it a whole other range of problems perhaps and implications. But according to the UN definition, mother tongue is the language usually spoken in the individual's home in his early childhood, although not necessarily used by him or her at present, which more or less describes, I think, the ways that mother tongues are used in Sweden. The term, of course, has been problematised by Skutner-Kangas and Philipson, also by Mulhauser, Marconi and Pennycook and a range of other researchers. So it is not without problems, but it is the name of the subject in Sweden, and it is the term that I will be using in this presentation. In Australia, these languages are called community languages, and this term was devised by Michael Klein in 1991. Generally speaking, this term has more positive associations to groups with shared cultural and linguistic values, but it potentially is misleading. Are English speakers in Australia, for example, a community, or is English a community language? True or false? There are some people that have argued that this term community languages is not really accurate either. So with this discussion, I just want to point out that the terms that I use in this presentation are not perfect, but they are what we have to work with at this stage. The ways that this form of education that I've investigated are arranged and organised in Sweden and Australia, the two countries that I've looked at, are very different. So in Sweden, mother tongue instruction has been an elective school subject since 1977, since the home language reform, and students who study mother tongue instruction gain points which contribute to their school leaving certificate score. The right to mother tongue instruction, or rather the right to develop and use mother tongues, is protected by the Language Act in Sweden, which has been effective since 2009. Students studying mother tongue instruction usually have about 1 hour per week of subject instruction. In Australia, the term community language education is used most commonly, and generally it takes place after hours, after school hours, often on Saturdays, which is why schools are sometimes called Saturday schools. They're usually run by volunteers and parents, and students in some community language schools can take external examinations which will contribute to their school leaving certificate, but that's not all community language schools that offer this option. In Australia, there's no legal protection for the use or development of languages other than English, and students studying in community language schools usually spend about 3 hours at these schools each week, significantly more than in Sweden. There's not been an enormous amount of research into either mother tongue instruction or community language schools in Australia, but in Sweden, the research that has been done has often pointed out the problems with the organisation and implementation of the subject. The fact that the groups are very heterogeneous, both linguistically and in terms of age and ability. Ideological factors, the fact that mother tongue instruction has got low status, is not understood as being beneficial by a wide range of stakeholders and people in general. There's been very limited classroom research conducted, but that which has been conducted indicates that there are certain benefits with mother tongue instruction, including the development of literacies in both the mother tongue and in Swedish. In Australia, there are quite a lot of studies of the grassroots movements that led to the development of community language schools, and also studies of individual language groups. So, for example, studies of the Italian development in the Italian community, or Greek, Danish, Swedish, and Chinese are some examples. Some studies have explored community language schools that connect in some way or another with the state school systems. And there's also been a focus on the heterogeneity of the groups and the ideologies associated with community language education in Australia. In both countries, there have been studies that have pointed to a general monolingual mindset in that community, which presents a hinder for the development of the languages being studied in these forms of education. I won't go into any more detail than that, but if you want to read more about these contexts, the literature on the contexts and the way the forms of education are organised, I invite you to read my thesis, published last year and available through this link at the bottom of this slide. In this study I'm presenting today, I have used translanguaging as a theoretical starting point, both as a pedagogy and as everyday practice. But if we start with translanguaging as a pedagogy, it developed in Wales, where it was called Trasietu in the beginning and was translated to translanguaging. Colin Baker has described translanguaging as the process of making meaning, shaping experiences, gaining understanding and knowledge through the use of two languages. And in fact, it was more of a methodology initially used in bilingual English-Welsh schools, whereby students would receive input in one language, English, and then were required to produce language in another language. So input in Welsh, output in English, and then in the next lesson, input in English, output in Welsh. Translanguaging has also been theorised as everyday practice among multilinguals. Kanagaraja wrote that for multilinguals, language is a part of a repertoire that's not accessed, for their communicative purposes. He argues that languages are not discrete and separated, but form an integrated system. And multilingual competence emerges out of local practices where multiple languages are negotiated for communication. He goes on to write about, at the bottom, that proficiency for multilinguals is focused on repertoire building rather than developing abilities in the different functions served by different languages, rather than total mastery of each and every language. So here we see that the emphasis here is not on developing some kind of imaginary balanced bilingualism, where students have perfect competencies in all the languages they speak, but rather they have strategic competencies in the languages that they speak. So onto this study and the analysis. I conducted focus group interviews with students studying both mother tongue instruction and community language education. 33 students partook in 4 focus group interviews. In Australia, the students were studying Vietnamese, and in Sweden, they were studying Turkish, Kurdish, and Arabic. I gave them discussion questions about their linguistic practices in different spaces. So, for example, on social media, with parents during maths while they were listening to music. And then I reported these responses into spaces. So what language practices were commonly reported in home spaces, leisure spaces, and school spaces. And we'll move on to the actual results now. Just to guide you through the tables, which will be repeated now over 4 slides. In the column here on the left, it's the student who is described. So here we have a grade 8 student in Sweden. These are results from Sweden, who's studying Arabic. Here is a grade 8 student studying Kurdish. This column here identifies the student either by a code or by just a number, which number they were, and also identifies them as being either a female, G for girl, or a male, B for boy. These columns here reflect the kind of questions that they were discussing. So here, these were responses in terms of language practices with parents or the older generation, siblings, friends, online practices, reading, listening to music or YouTube, telling jokes, sending SMSs, writing, mainstream school, and maths. And you can see here that I've categorized these practices in the academic space, these in the personal leisure space, and these in the home space. I have already indicated that this analysis is preliminary, and for example, I find responses to reading practices a bit difficult because although I placed them initially in personal leisure space, I think for many students today, reading tends to take place mostly in the academic space. So that's something I'm not completely clear about yet. The colours used here, if students indicate that they use a heritage or a mother tongue only, so for example here, Arabic only, A for Arabic, I've coloured that in blue. If they indicate they use Swedish only, I've coloured that red, S for Swedish. And on all the other spaces, it's where students indicate that they use different languages depending on the context, and sometimes combinations of languages. There are 2 yellow boxes here where a student indicated that she only used English, E. But this was not characteristic at all. It was a student who obviously enjoyed studying English. So I think what you can see from this pattern here, this responses among the grade 8 students, is that the majority of students report using lots of different languages, especially in personal leisure space, but even at home and even to some extent at school when they're writing. If we move on to the responses from the Year 9 group, it is similar. Again, Turkish used at home only Turkish used in the home environment. In the academic space, a lot of Swedish, but otherwise very mixed language use reported here. The next slide reports on the Vietnamese school in Australia. I'm going through this quite quickly, I'm sorry, just to leave time for the discussion. So here, the students were grade 12. The first chart reflects responses from grade 12 students. This is grade 12 in the Vietnamese school. There are actually more grade 11 in the mainstream school. The way they grouped students was slightly different in the Vietnamese school. But here we see that students reported speaking Vietnamese only, mostly in the home space. Here there's one student who reported using Vietnamese only online, which is quite unusual. Again, English only in a few other spaces here, right? A little bit in the home space with siblings, which we recognise from the literature. Also online, a lot of English being used, and of course in school, writing. But this is different from the Swedish reported language practices in the Swedish context, where other languages were used in writing in the academic space, or at least reported being used. And in this particular class, we see that Vietnamese is being used in maths. This was due to a rather unusual situation in that there were students from Vietnam visiting the school that a lot of these students attended, and the students said that they had been helping the Vietnamese students with maths by talking Vietnamese to them and explaining terms. This chart here shows what the grade 9 students at the Vietnamese school reported. a lot more Vietnamese only being reported here, being used at home, and the academic school space very much dominated by English. And quite a lot of English, even in personal leisure space here. But again, a lot of students report using a whole range of languages, even Korean here, Hindi, students who are listening to Bollywood movies, studying Japanese, J there for Japanese. So this is what the charts that I devised look like. And some of the conclusions that I've drawn and the implications are that there are certainly similarities between Sweden and Australia. Student responses indicate that they do engage in the process of making meaning, shaping experiences, gaining understanding and knowledge through the use of two languages, or translanguaging, in a majority of the contexts that they were presented with in the interviews. But there are differences as well. I think in Australia there is slightly more polarisation in reported language use, slightly more use of Vietnamese only and more use of English only. Whereas in Sweden, there seem to be multilingual practices reported in a wider range of contexts. But on the whole, multilingual practices in fact dominate, which indicates to me that there is a need for the development of translanguaging pedagogies which valorise and enable development of flexible linguistic repertoires. There's also a need to contest this multilingual mindset which has been identified in both contexts, as it does not reflect the linguistic practices reported by the students in this study. Limitations on this study: it is a small sample only. There are slightly different age groups, somewhat clunky categorisation at this stage, which I'm still working on, and potentially ambiguous questions. Some students found a question like, what language or words do you use, difficult to deal with, and it is difficult to think and report accurately on the words and languages that you use, I think. And there's actually in this particular analysis no investigation of the actual words that students use to describe their language practices. But I have looked at that in two other articles, one which is already published and one which will be coming up next year. So they are given in the reference list. And if you're interested about what students actually say, you're very welcome to read those papers. Just to give you a little bit of an idea about what I talk about in those papers, when I asked students in the very initial question what their mother tongue was, what language they used at home, they didn't always find it easy to respond to that. So, for example, a grade 9 student in Sweden studying Turkish as a mother tongue, she said, "Det är svårt att säga." It's difficult to say. She studied Turkish as a mother tongue, but she spoke Kurdish at home, but then reported using Spanish a lot in social media. She studied Spanish as a modern language and felt most comfortable communicating in Swedish. So she found it quite difficult to say what her mother tongue was. This indicates that for her, these languages perhaps were not really discrete and separated, but formed an integrated system for her. And her multilingual competence emerged out of the way she described these local practices, where she negotiated multiple languages to communicate in different contexts. Thanks very much for listening. Here are some references if you're interested in following up anything I've said, and you're also welcome to drop me an email. My email address is on the first slide, or participate in the online discussion that this conference offers. Thanks for listening.